Stranger Things was never really about monsters. It wasn't about alternate dimensions, government conspiracies, or saving the world from some ultimate evil.
I mean, it was.
But from the very beginning, at its core, it was also a story about fear, quiet, personal fear, and about the people we rely on to survive it. Season 1 understood that. It knew that the most terrifying things aren't always loud or visible. They're the things no one else believes are real, the things hiding just beneath the surface of ordinary life. But somewhere along the way, Stranger Things forgot that. By the time we reach Season 5, the mystery is gone, the fear has been explained away, and what was once horror has been replaced by spectacle. The show didn't just change its story, it changed how it tried to scare us. And in doing so, it stopped being frightening altogether. In this video, I want to focus specifically on that problem, how Stranger Things lost its sense of horror, why it stopped being scary, and why that loss matters more than any plot hole or controversial creative decision. Quick disclaimer before we begin.
English isn't my first language, so I appreciate your patience if I make any mistake.
One of the most important elements of Stranger Things Season 1, at least to me, is the mystery surrounding the Upside Down. It's not just that we don't fully understand it, it's that the show is smart enough to let that lack of understanding linger. In Season 2, which I consider a slightly weaker but still very well made sequel, we explore the Upside Down even further, and what's brilliant is that the more we learn, the more unsettling it becomes. The Demogorgons, the Demodogs, the Mind Flayer, the underground tunnels, Will's possession, none of these things demystify the threat, they amplify it. Each answer only raises more questions, deepening the sense of fear and uncertainty. And here's my hot take, not every mystery needs to be solved. There is something profoundly effective about the idea of incomprehensible forces bleeding into our reality from an obscure, hostile dimension. The Upside Down works precisely because it remains unknowable, a toxic, putrefying mirror of our world, home to vicious predators like the Demogorgon, all operating under the singular, oppressive consciousness of the Mind Flayer. It represents an alien logic we can't fully grasp, an evil that doesn't need a clear origin or motivation to be terrifying. And here's 2 crucial points. The Upside Down is far more terrifying than Vecna, the Mind Flayer, or any singular entity we encounter later in Stranger Things. At its core, the Upside Down represents horror rooted in the unknown. It is the fear of something vast, ancient, and fundamentally alien slipping through the cracks of our reality, not unleashed by destiny or prophecy, but by human arrogance. Government hubris, the belief that everything can be controlled, categorized, and understood, opens the door to something that was never meant to be touched. And Stranger Things is at its strongest when it allows that terror to remain just out of reach, never fully explained, never fully contained. What makes the Upside Down so unsettling is not just what lives there, but what it is. It is not merely a location or an enemy territory, it is a distorted reflection of our own world. Familiar, but wrong. Colder, emptier, decaying. It follows an alien logic that we cannot fully grasp, which is precisely why it works as horror. Once you define it too clearly, once you give it a face, a name, or a human motivation, it becomes smaller. The Upside Down is terrifying precisely because it mirrors our world, more specifically, the world of Hawkins. Dark places and monsters on their own aren't what truly scare us. What's terrifying is the idea that these things exist within our world, not outside of it. That they are a part of it. A part that everyone senses is there, everyone feels pressing in on them, but no one ever talks about. That's why, in the first season, it's so effective that children are the ones who uncover this truth. As a kid, you are sure there was a monster under your bed. Absolutely sure. Even when your parents came in, turned on the lights, and showed you there was nothing there, you still believed it was hiding, waiting until you were alone again. You felt like you were the only one who could see it. You believed the monster was only there for you, and that as long as someone else was in the room, you were safe. The unsettling truth is that adulthood isn't all that different. The monster doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. It becomes insecurity, fear of failure, fear of conformity, fear of loss, fear of pain. And just like when you were a child, everyone around you acts as if the monster isn't there. You know it's hiding under the bed. You know fear and insecurity are living inside you, waiting to consume you, but you don't say anything, because it feels like you're the only one who can see it. And the worst part? Most of the time, there are no parents left to come in and stay the night with you. You're alone. That's the scariest thing of all. That's what Stranger Things captures so well. Hopper's monster is the death of his daughter, and the belief that he was responsible for it. Joyce's monster is the fear that she isn't a good enough mother, no matter how hard she tries. especially when her son goes missing for an entire night and she doesn't even notice. Jonathan's monster is loneliness, the fear of being an outcast, of always being seen as a freak. Nancy's monster is becoming her parents, conforming to a life she's always hated, a fear that crystallizes the moment she leaves Barb alone. And the kid's monster is the fear of failing their friend, and quite literally, the monster itself, because they're still children. None of them talk about these fears at first. They pretend they don't exist. We can see them because we're the audience, but no one outside their personal worlds can. But what if those monsters were real? What if the things everyone insists are imaginary actually existed? That is what the Upside Down represents. And what if, now that you don't have your parents to protect you, the only way to defeat those monsters is by trusting other people, by opening up, by speaking the fear out loud, by facing it together? That has always been the true core of Stranger Things. Coming together to confront what terrifies us, and realizing that the unknown becomes survivable, not when it's explained, but when it's shared. The Upside Down was never at its most frightening because of what lived inside it, but because of what it represented. It was a physical manifestation of everything we refuse to confront: fear, grief, guilt, isolation. The parts of ourselves and our world we pretend aren't there. By keeping it unknowable, Stranger Things tapped into a deeply human terror, the idea that something cold and incomprehensible exists just beneath the surface of our reality, waiting for the moment we're most vulnerable. As the series progressed, that fear slowly gave way to explanation. The unknown became defined, the abstract became personal. And in doing so, the Upside Down lost much of what made it powerful. It stopped feeling like a vast, indifferent force bleeding into our world and started feeling like a problem that could be solved, a villain that could be defeated. But in its earliest form, the Upside Down worked because it wasn't something you could fully understand or control. It mirrored our world, our fears, and our emotional failures, reminding us that monsters don't always come from another dimension. Sometimes they're already here, hiding in plain sight. And the only way to survive them isn't through answers or explanations, but through connection, through trust, through people coming together when the darkness feels overwhelming. That's why the Upside Down mattered. Not as a place, not as a villain, but as a metaphor for the fear we all carry, and the fragile human act of facing it together. To understand why this worked, we need to talk briefly about horror as a genre. Horror isn't really about monsters or spectacle. Those are just tools. At its core, horror works best when it's anchored to fears we already carry in real life: loss, isolation, guilt, helplessness. The best horror doesn't create fear out of nothing. It gives shape to anxieties that already exist, and it does so in familiar spaces, places that should feel safe but suddenly don't. This is where trauma in storytelling becomes important. Trauma isn't automatically exploitative, nor is it there just to make a story darker. When handled with care, it can be one of the most powerful elements in horror because trauma already functions like horror. It isolates, it distorts reality, and it turns everyday life into something threatening. The problem isn't using trauma, it's using it superficially as backstory or aesthetic without letting it actually shape the story. A good example of this kind of horror is The Haunting of Bly Manor, another Netflix series. I won't go into heavy spoilers about everything that happens in the show, but there is one specific element that really matters here: the figure that haunts the protagonist, Danny. Danny is a queer woman living in the 1980s who begins working as an au pair in a large, isolated house. From the very beginning, we see her repeatedly catching sight of a terrifying man reflected in mirrors and windows, a figure with glowing eyes. At first, we don't know who he is or why he's there. Later, we learn that the apparition is her former fiancé. Danny and him had been together for most of their lives, and he proposes to her. But as the wedding approaches, the show strongly hints that Danny is deeply conflicted about her sexual identity. She breaks off the engagement, and that same night, her fiancé is killed in an accident right in front of her. What makes this horror effective, and what connects it to everything I've been talking about, is that the ghost isn't just a supernatural threat. It's the physical manifestation of Danny's guilt, repression, and unresolved trauma. The show doesn't use her pain for shock value, it turns it into meaning. The figure is terrifying on itself, but we understand that Danny sees it not because of its appearance, but because of what it represents, which is what truly scares her.
I know this sounds familiar. I'll return to it later.
Season 1 of Stranger Things understood this perfectly. Fear, grief, and isolation weren't just traits the characters had, they were the engine of the horror itself. The supernatural elements didn't replace those emotions, they amplified them. The Upside Down felt frightening not because it was dangerous, but because it reflected what the characters were already feeling inside. By allowing that fear to remain unresolved and unexplained, the show trusted the audience to sit with discomfort. And that restraint is what made the horror work. It didn't need to be louder or bigger, it just needed to feel real. Now that we understand what the Upside Down represents, it's time to talk about Vecna as a villain. And I want to start with something positive, because not everything here is bad. If we accept that Stranger Things was most likely not conceived as a 5-season story, something that at this point feels almost certain even if it hasn't been openly acknowledged, then the introduction of Vecna becomes much easier to understand. Expanding the timeline inevitably requires recentering the conflict, and from a structural standpoint, Vecna isn't a terrible idea. Humanizing a villain is not inherently a flaw. In fact, many of the most compelling antagonists in storytelling are human in some way. That humanity adds complexity, contrast, and emotional weight to the conflict. And to be clear, humanization does not mean redemption. A villain can be fundamentally evil and still be human. Those two ideas are not mutually exclusive. But it is also important to say this. Stranger Things would have completely failed if Vecna had been turned solely into a purely human villain, stripped of all conceptual or symbolic weight.
Hi, Season 5.
And yet, in Season 4, it actually works. Really well. Season 4 felt redemptive after Season 3, which in my opinion is weaker than the 2 seasons that came before it, even if it was widely enjoyed.
And I myself enjoyed it a lot.
So why did it work? Here's the key. Vecna in Season 4 was terrifying, something Season 5 completely lost. But why was he so scary? I still believe the Upside Down itself, and even a single Demogorgon in Season 1 were scarier, and the Mind Flayer even more so. Yet Vecna remains deeply frightening. Why? Because Vecna, not just as Henry, but as a concept, is genuinely compelling. His defining mechanic, the ability to invade people's minds, to exploit trauma, guilt, and suppressed pain, is one of the strongest horror ideas the show has introduced since Season 1. It externalizes internal suffering in a way that feels thematically rich, especially for a story that has always been about adolescence, fear, and emotional isolation. Vecna doesn't just kill his victims. He breaks them psychologically before he ever touches them. He weaponizes memory. He turns grief and shame into literal vulnerabilities. And that's compelling, not just as spectacle, but as metaphor. This is what connects him to the earlier seasons. Vecna isn't scary just because of his physical appearance or the horrific way he kills people. He's scary because of what he does to their minds. Vecna takes your deepest trauma, something you hide from everyone else, something that defines your days, something that follows you wherever you go, and turns it into his most powerful weapon. And isn't that something many of us have experienced ourselves or watched people we love go through? Being Vecna'd is fundamentally about being consumed by trauma. And what's especially brilliant is that the symptoms of being under Vecna's spell are things like headaches, nightmares, dissociation, symptoms that are extremely common in depression.
How were Chrissy or Max supposed to know something supernatural was happening to them? What they were experiencing didn't seem that strange if they were already mentally broken.
This works well with Chrissy, but it works exceptionally well with Max. Max being hunted by Vecna is more terrifying than anything we see in Season 5, even more than the final monster, no matter how big or grotesque it is. Why? Because what Max is going through before Vecna ever fully appears is already horrifying. Season 3 shows us a Max who is full of light, fully integrated into the group, finally forming a real friendship with Eleven. And then Season 4 opens on a completely different version of her. Her life is gray and hollow. She's consumed by Billy's death, by the guilt of their complicated relationship, by the fact that he sacrificed himself to save her. She's living in a trailer park with a mother who is also deeply depressed. She's isolated from her friends. She's broken up with Lucas. That's terrifying because it's relatable. Because so many people have lived through that or watched someone they love disappear into that kind of emotional numbness. Once the characters realize Vecna is targeting Max, you genuinely fear for her life. And doesn't that feeling sound familiar? Fearing for someone you love because their trauma is consuming them? That's why the running up that hill scene is one of the best moments in the entire series. Max isn't just running from Vecna, she's fighting her trauma. She's fighting it through music, something almost everyone can relate to, but also through memories of the life that once made her happy. Her friends, Eleven, Lucas. It's an incredibly powerful metaphor for depression. Anyone who has experienced it knows what it feels like to be Max, running against all odds, clinging to memories of joy, trying desperately not to be swallowed by the darkness. And that is why Vecna worked in Season 4, but what they did with it in Season 5.
One word, nothing.
Actually, that's not entirely true. They do this with Hopper, once, one single time in the entire season, and it ultimately amounts to nothing. There is a brief moment where the show toys with the idea that Vecna's reach, or the Mind Flayer's influence, might extend beyond the Hawkins teens. Hopper experiences a vision, a psychological intrusion that could have opened the door to something much larger. The idea that this force doesn't just target the young or the emotionally vulnerable, but anyone carrying unresolved guilt, grief, or failure. And that's a fascinating idea. Hopper is a character defined by loss, his daughter, his marriage, his sense of purpose. If Vecna's power is truly rooted in trauma, Hopper should be one of the most vulnerable characters in the show. But the series does nothing with it. That moment isn't explored, expanded, or integrated into the larger narrative. It doesn't affect Hopper's choices. It doesn't change how he approaches the conflict. It doesn't deepen Vecna's threat. It's introduced, briefly acknowledged, and then discarded, as if the show itself wasn't sure what to do with the implications. And that's emblematic of the larger problem. Season 4 understands Vecna thematically. It understands why he's scary, why he works, why his power resonates. But as the story moves forward, especially into Season 5, that understanding starts to fracture. Vecna stops being a psychological predator and becomes just another physical obstacle, louder, bigger, more grotesque, but far less unsettling. The show trades internal horror for external spectacle. Trauma becomes backstory instead of the battleground, and once that happens, Vecna loses the very thing that made him effective in the first place. Because the truth is, Vecna was never at his most terrifying when he was killing people. He was terrifying when he was almost killing them, when he was sitting inside their heads, convincing them they deserved it. And that's the version of Vecna the show slowly abandons. And this is where the show truly misses an incredible opportunity. Vecna knows that 11 is his greatest threat. He knows she's the only one who can stop him, but he also knows something else. 11 does not stand alone. She survives because of her friends, because of the people she loves and relies on. And for 11, her greatest failure isn't something abstract or philosophical. It's Max. She couldn't save her, not completely. Max survives, but she's broken, unreachable, suspended in a kind of living limbo. And that guilt defines 11 going into the final stretch of the story. So why not play with that? Why not let Vecna weaponize that failure? Imagine Vecna slowly, deliberately attacking the people 11 loves. Not physically, not all at once, but mentally, one by one. Targeting Lucas's grief, Dustin's fear of losing another brother figure, Mike's constant terror of not being enough, Hopper's guilt and sense of responsibility. Each attack wouldn't just be about killing. It would be about isolating 11, stripping away the emotional support system that gives her strength. That would have been devastating. And yes, this is a problem people have pointed out countless times in modern TV. The escalation trap. Each season introduces a villain who has to be bigger, stronger, more invincible than the last, until the story has to arbitrarily weaken them just to make victory possible. But this would have been a different kind of escalation, not more power, more precision. Vecna doesn't need to be louder or more unstoppable. He needs to be smarter, crueler, in a quieter way. If his power is rooted in trauma, then targeting the emotional bonds between the characters, especially 11's, would have been the most logical and the most horrifying move he could make. Instead of making Vecna less powerful so the heroes can win, the show could have leaned into what made him terrifying in the first place. A villain who doesn't rush the kill, who dismantles you emotionally before you ever realize what's happening. And honestly, it would have hurt more. It would have felt earned. And it would have stayed true to the thematic core of Stranger Things, that love and connection are both the characters' greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability. And coming back to what I say about horror and trauma earlier in the video, there was a lot of potential there because a similar idea appears in Stranger Things Season 5 with Will, particularly in the first volume's finale.
I thought that was where they were taking the show, and I was so confused when in Volume 2 it amounted to nothing.
At that point, his storyline worked really well. He confronted Vecna not just physically, but emotionally by accepting himself and facing the fear inside him, his struggle with his identity and sexuality. That combination of external and internal horror gave his arc real weight, much like Danny's trauma in Bly Manor became the source of its terror. But unfortunately, the show immediately undermines that moment. Will is sidelined afterward, his journey reduced to nothing, and his coming out scene is handled poorly.
I don't like girls.
Erasing the emotional power the show had briefly built. But imagine that, just as Max had to confront Billy's death at Vecna's hands, Will could have faced his own fears as well, but with the twist the show introduces, and that raised the stakes even higher, his ability to use Vecna's powers, If done properly, this could have turned his internal struggle into something active and empowering, making his journey not only about acceptance, but also about agency. Instead, the show sidelines him, losing the opportunity to expand on what made his arc so compelling in the first place. And yes, I know the show, and especially the final season, has a huge number of problems. The Marvelification of the series, the non-existent or completely ruined character arcs, the tonal shift that makes it feel like a different show altogether, the cringy dialogue, the coming out scene, the final fight being the shortest and easiest in the universe, the fact that there are no major deaths and basically no stakes at all, the endless plot holes, and all the far more interesting narrative paths they could have taken instead. There are already countless videos out there discussing all of this. I'll be making one specifically about 11's ending later on,
So stay tuned for that.
I think the real problem with Stranger Things is that it lost its essence a long time ago. Somewhere along the way, the show forgot why it began and what its story was meant to represent. The Upside Down stopped being a source of dread and became just another parallel dimension, one whose origins the series tried to explain without ever fully committing, creating more plot holes than clarity in the process. Concepts like the Abyss, introduced as replacements, feel far less evocative because they prioritize lore over meaning. And while not every mystery needs an answer, if the show was determined to explain everything, then the nature of the Mind Flayer, the central force behind it all, should have been the most important question to resolve. Instead, it remains oddly undefined. What made the Upside Down work, and why losing its mystery mattered so much, is that it was never terrifying because it could be mapped, understood, or defeated. It was terrifying because it couldn't. It functioned as an unknowable reflection of fear, grief, and isolation bleeding quietly into everyday life. By turning it into something that needed to be explained rather than felt, Stranger Things traded existential horror for a narrative convenience. The show was never at its strongest when it provided answers, but when it asked us to sit with uncertainty and reminded us that the only real defense against that darkness was human connection. The Upside Down didn't need an origin story or a final boss. It needed to remain a mirror, and once that mirror shattered, so did the quiet, unsettling power that made the series feel real. The same misunderstanding ultimately doomed Vecna. He didn't fail because he was too weak or too human. He failed because the show stopped understanding why he worked. Season 4 briefly returned to the core of Stranger Things, turning trauma into horror and making grief the true battlefield. Vecna was frightening not because of how he killed, but because of how he invaded minds and dismantled emotional bonds. But as the series moved forward, that internal horror was abandoned in favor of louder monsters and easier victories. Vecna became just another obstacle to overcome, instead of a reflection of the character's inner darkness. And that is the real tragedy. Stranger Things had a villain perfectly designed to challenge its central theme, that connection is both our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability, and instead of leaning into that truth, it chose spectacle over meaning. If you liked the video, subscribe and leave a like. Also, feel free to comment your opinions. I love reading you guys, and it helps me create more content.